The stars in the galactic core had always been a symbol of peace and prosperity. For centuries, Earth had thrived at the heart of this interstellar community, a beacon of unity among countless species. But that serenity was shattered in a single moment. As the first wave of the Athex fleet entered the core's outer rim, an eerie silence fell across Earth's space stations. Suddenly, a piercing alarm shattered the stillness, breaking the calm and heralding the arrival of an enemy unlike any humanity had ever encountered. Massive ships, dark and foreboding, emerged from the depths of space, cutting through the void with an unnatural precision. The Athex were here. Commander Ilara Wolf stood at the command bridge of the Vanguard, her hands gripped tightly on the controls as the familiar hum of the ship's engines filled her ears. The crew, seasoned and resolute, were all well aware of the threat the Athex posed, but no one had imagined they would strike so suddenly without warning. "Status report," Ilara barked, her voice cutting through the tension in the air. Ensign Marcus, one of her most trusted officers, his face pale and tense, turned to her. "Commander, their ships. There's too many of them. The Vanguard can't hold up against that firepower." Ilara's mind raced. The Vanguard was one of the most advanced warships in Earth's fleet, but against a fleet of this size, it seemed insignificant. Humanity had never faced an enemy of such overwhelming scale. The Athex had a reputation for their ruthless efficiency and their technology, far beyond what any of Earth's forces had ever seen. "Activate the shields. Order the fleet to form defensive positions. Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Ilara ordered. Her voice, though commanding, wavered only slightly. It was the kind of battle no one was truly prepared for. As the Vanguard sprang into action, the holographic maps flickered on the bridge's central display, showing the first wave of Athex ships moving rapidly toward Earth. It was clear the Athex weren't here to negotiate. They were here to conquer. Contacting all fleet units, Lieutenant Torres said, her fingers flying over her console as she sent orders to Earth's scattered defense fleets. "They'll be ready to engage within moments. But, Commander, look at their weapons." A deep rumbling noise vibrated through the hull as the first salvo of Athex energy weapons lanced toward the fleet. The blast was devastating. Earth's ships, caught in the crossfire, were torn apart in seconds. The Vanguard lurched as a shockwave reverberated through its frame. Alarms blared across the bridge, and the crew scrambled to maintain control. Ilara clenched her jaw, watching the destruction unfold on the outer hull. "Shields at 50%, reported Lieutenant Ansel. His voice was tight, filled with the same disbelief Ilara felt. "We won't last much longer at this rate. Hold steady. Order the remaining fleets to form a defensive perimeter. Earth's colonies need to be evacuated," Ilara said, her voice cold, determined. "We can't afford to lose any more." Outside the viewport, Earth's shining cities were already in chaos. The Athex had struck without warning, targeting key military outposts and colony hubs. The battle had already spread to the surface, but the true cost wouldn't be known until Earth's civilian fleets could react. And for that, they had only a small window of time before the full fury of the Athex's second wave would arrive. But in the midst of it all, Ilara felt a tightening in her chest. Her younger brother, Lieutenant Jaden Wolf, was stationed on the Argonaut, one of the ships she had assigned to the defensive line. He had always been brilliant, resourceful, and fearless. He was an officer she trusted more than anyone. "Lieutenant Torres, patch me through to the Argonaut," Ilara demanded, her voice rising. As the connection flickered to life, Jaden's familiar face appeared on the screen. His youthful face was tense, his eyes scanning the battle around him. "Commander," Jaden said quickly, "we're under heavy fire. They're overwhelming us. We need support." The transmission cut off abruptly. Ilara's stomach sank as she watched the screen flash with static. "No," she whispered to herself, her hand hovering over the console, ready to act. Her brother was out there, caught in the chaos. She couldn't lose him. Not now. "Lieutenant, "Redirect the fleet toward the Argonaut," Ilara ordered, her voice firm despite the growing panic. "We can't let them fall." The crew exchanged nervous glances, but no one hesitated. Ilara knew the risks. Every moment counted. The Athex had already shown how brutal they could be, and Earth's forces were only beginning to learn just how far the enemy would go to ensure victory. As the vanguard moved toward the heart of the conflict, Ilara's mind sharpened. She had to save her brother, and every human alive in the core, no matter the cost. The vanguard tore through the shattered space above Earth's orbit, its engines straining against the weight of the battle unfolding below. Ilara Wolf's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the chaotic scene outside the bridge's viewport. The enemy was relentless. Athex warships, large and sleek, fired devastating energy blasts, reducing entire colonies and defense stations to molten ruins. Humanity's might, represented by Earth's combined fleet, struggled to hold its ground. But Ilara knew their chances of survival grew slimmer with each passing moment. "Commander, we're coming up on the Argonaut," Lieutenant Torres called out, her voice tense but determined. "We've detected several Athex ships in pursuit. We need to move fast." Ilara nodded, her mind racing with calculations and strategy. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and on the brink of collapse. But if they couldn't rescue the Argonaut, all was lost. And with her brother aboard, failure was unthinkable. "Deploy the fighter squadron. I want them to engage those Athex ships," Ilara commanded, her eyes never leaving the display showing the rapidly closing distance. "Once we're within range, we'll provide covering fire." The fighter pilots, always eager for a fight, responded with a chorus of affirmations. The Vanguard's hangar doors opened, releasing sleek fighter crafts into the void. The battle ahead was as much a test of humanity's will to survive as it was a test of their unity. Despite the dire situation, Earth's fleet fought with everything they had. "Commander, the Argonaut has lost communication," Ensign Marcus reported, his face grim. "We're getting a distress signal, but it's faint. They're overwhelmed." Ilara clenched her fists. Her brother was in the thick of it, surrounded by Athex forces, and there was no way to know whether he was still alive. She couldn't afford to let that thought consume her, but it gnawed at the back of her mind, growing louder with every passing second. "Push ahead. Full speed," Ilara ordered. "We're not leaving anyone behind." As the Vanguard closed in on the Argonaut, the bridge crew sprang into action, monitoring enemy movements, calculating evasive maneuvers, and preparing for what could be their final assault. The tension was palpable, a thick, suffocating weight pressing down on them. In a matter of moments, they would either strike the decisive blow or become another casualty in the war for the core. "Enemy fire incoming," Lieutenant Ansel shouted, pointing to a rapidly approaching wave of Athex missiles. Their sleek forms glinted ominously in the distance. "Braced for impact," Ilara yelled, instinctively gripping her console. The Vanguard shook violently as the first of the missiles slammed into their shields, sending ripples of energy across the hull. The impact reverberated throughout the ship, but the shields held. "Shields at 70%, Ansel reported, "but we can't keep this up much longer." "We don't have time to play defense," Ilara said, her voice steady despite the pressure. "Take them out, now." Without hesitation, the crew fired back, lancing bright beams of energy into the Athex ships, sending them spiraling off course or exploding in spectacular fireballs. Yet for every ship they destroyed, two more seemed to take its place. The Athex were relentless, their strategy clear: overwhelm the human fleet until it broke. In the midst of this chaos, a sudden shout echoed across the bridge. "Commander, the Argonaut is in distress. 2 Athex dreadnoughts are closing in fast. They're targeting the reactor." "Get us in closer," Ilara barked. The Vanguard veered sharply to the left, diving into the chaos with unyielding determination. Earth's fleet was being torn apart, but they had to act quickly. Her brother's life, her brother's very survival, hung in the balance. "Commander, we've detected life signs on the Argonaut," Ensign Marcus said. "It's coming from the lower decks, but they're rapidly depleting. They might be trapped." Ilara's heart raced. The life signs weren't just any crew members. Her brother's signal was among them. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath. She had hoped for a moment of clarity, a chance to plan their next move with precision, but the reality of the situation had no room for hesitation. Every second mattered now. "Deploy the remaining fighter squads. We'll cover the rescue teams," Ilara ordered. "I'm going in personally." The room went quiet for a moment, the crew looking at her in shock. She wasn't known to take such risks, but there was no other choice. She had to get to the Argonaut herself. There was no time to waste. "Commander, are you sure?" Lieutenant Torres asked, her voice laced with concern. "I'll be fine," Ilara said, her tone unwavering. "We'll get them out." Ilara's mind shifted into overdrive. She couldn't let emotions cloud her judgment, but the thought of losing her brother was unbearable. Still, she knew the price of failure now. To lose this battle was to lose everything. As the Vanguard plunged deeper into the heart of the conflict, Ilara's determination solidified. No matter the cost, no matter the odds, humanity would stand. And she would make sure the Athex learned what it truly meant to face Earth's warriors. The Vanguard surged forward, its engines roaring as it cut through the chaos surrounding the Argonaut. Ilara's mind was a blur of calculations. The danger they faced no longer just theoretical. It was real, immediate, and relentless. Earth's fleet was scattered and outgunned, but she refused to give up on the survivors aboard the Argonaut, especially when her brother was among them. "Commander, we're nearing the Argonaut's last known position," Ensign Marcus called, his voice shaking with barely contained anxiety. "We have Athex ships closing in fast. They're not giving us any room to maneuver. Deploy evasive maneuvers, now." Ilara snapped, her gaze locked on the looming dreadnoughts. They were massive, far larger than any human-built vessel, their sleek hulls reflecting the cold light of distant stars. It wasn't just their size that made the Athex ships so deadly. It was their firepower. Their energy weapons could decimate an entire fleet in seconds. Outside the Vanguard's reinforced viewports, Ilara could see the Argonaut, its hull battered and scorched, surrounded by two Athex dreadnoughts. The larger ships were blocking their path, their dark, angular forms making it almost impossible to approach. The Argonaut's signal was still faint, but alive. Her brother was out there somewhere. She could feel his presence like a thread pulling her forward. "Activate countermeasures, engage their flanks," Ilara ordered, her voice steady even as the battle raged around them. "We'll create an opening, and we'll make it count." The Vanguard pivoted sharply, veering toward the right side of the Athex blockade. The space around them flared to life as the ship's weapons opened fire, a dazzling array of energy beams streaking toward the Athex ships. But even as they retaliated, Ilara knew the odds were slim. The Vanguard was strong, but it wasn't invincible. Still, she fought with every ounce of her being, every memory of Earth's strength, her heart burning with resolve. The first salvo struck the leftmost dreadnought, the impact sending it reeling. Yet it wasn't enough to disable the ship. Ilara's heart sank. They needed more than just firepower. They needed time, the kind of time that only a tactical maneuver could buy. "Lieutenant Ansel, I need that opening," Ilara said, her eyes narrowing as the Athex ships adjusted their fire. "Target their engines. We need to cripple them, make them vulnerable." Ansel didn't hesitate. The Vanguard's main weapons fired in quick succession, each blast striking the Athex ship with precision. One of the dreadnoughts shuddered as its left engine exploded, sending the vessel careening off course. The second dreadnought was forced to divert its course to avoid a collision, creating a momentary gap in their formation. "Now, move in," Ilara commanded. Without waiting for a response, she was already standing, her hand on the door to the bridge. "Commander, you can't," Lieutenant Torres shouted, her voice alarmed. "We don't know what's waiting for you over there. It's too dangerous." "I don't have a choice," Ilara replied, her voice cold and firm. "I'm going to get my brother." Before anyone could stop her, Ilara rushed toward the exit, her boots clanging on the floor as she made her way to the Vanguard's docking bay. The moment she stepped inside the shuttle, the doors slammed shut behind her. The craft hummed to life, its engines roaring as she shot toward the Argonaut, her mind laser-focused on her objective. She couldn't afford to think about anything else. She had no time for second thoughts, no room for doubt. Her brother, the crew of the Argonaut, Earth itself, they were all counting on her. The shuttle bucked as it entered the heart of the battle. Outside, explosions ripped through space, casting an eerie light across the chaos. Ilara gritted her teeth, maneuvering the shuttle with practiced skill. Her hand shook slightly as she gripped the controls, but her determination was unwavering. There on the horizon was the Argonaut. Its hull was scared, riddled with the signs of a brutal firefight. She could only imagine what horrors its crew had endured to keep fighting. "Come on, Jaden," Ilara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm coming for you." As she neared the Argonaut, another blast shook the shuttle, sending it tumbling momentarily. The Athex ships were already reorienting, their guns aiming directly at the shuttle's small form. Time was running out. "I need a clear path," Ilara shouted to herself, slamming her fist against the console. She wasn't about to lose her brother, not when she was this close. With one final desperate maneuver, she plunged into the heart of the conflict. The shuttle's hull groaned under the stress as she angled it toward a narrow gap between two enemy dreadnoughts. She could feel the heat of the weapons as they streaked past her, narrowly missing. Finally, the shuttle breached the last line of defense. Ilara's breath caught in her throat. Ahead of her, the escape hatch of the Argonaut was open. Her brother's face flashed in her mind. He was alive. She would bring him home. The shuttle's engine screamed as Ilara guided it toward the Argonaut's docking bay, her eyes locked on the swirling chaos of battle behind her. The immediate danger was still far from over. The Athex ships were relentless, and now that they had targeted her shuttle, there was no turning back. She could feel the heat of their weapon blasts in her bones, the ship shuddering violently as one stray shot grazed the hull. Sparks flew across her controls, and for a terrifying moment, the shuttle's systems flickered. Come on," Ilara muttered, gritting her teeth as she fought to regain control. The shuttle's response time was sluggish, but she couldn't afford to slow down. She was running out of time. Her brother, her crew, Earth's last defense, it all hung in the balance. Another blast from an Athex fighter clipped the shuttle's wing, sending it spinning. The stars outside twisted into streaks of light as the shuttle tumbled toward the Argonaut. "Not now, damn it," Ilara growled. With a final, desperate twist of the controls, she righted the shuttle and aimed it straight for the open hangar bay. She could see the Argonaut's crew scrambling for safety, her brother's signal growing stronger as she neared the vessel. They were alive. She wasn't going to let that end today. As the shuttle blasted into the hangar, it screeched across the deck with an ear-splitting noise, the force of the landing knocking Ilara forward into the harness. Her heart slammed in her chest, but she immediately cut the engines, the deafening noise replaced by an eerie silence. She wasn't dead. She hadn't failed. But her work was far from over. The bay was a scene of devastation, damaged ships, overturned equipment, and injured crew members scrambling for shelter. The scent of burning metal and ionized air filled the shuttle. Her instincts kicked in. Ilara yanked open the shuttle's hatch and jumped out, her boots slamming into the floor. "Commander Wolf, you made it." Lieutenant Hill, a Argonaut officer, shouted from nearby, his face streaked with soot and blood. "We're still holding on, but they've breached the lower levels. We need to move. Now." Ilara nodded, eyes scanning the area. Despite the chaos, she could see a few of the Argonaut's fighters still operational, their crews moving fast to prepare for another sortie. It wasn't enough. Not nearly. I'm going after Jaden. He's alive, right? Ilara asked, forcing herself to stay focused. Last I checked, Hill said, his face tight with concern, but they're pinned down in the reactor chamber. We've got wounded, plenty of them, but we can't get through the Athex forces to reach them. Ilara clenched her jaw. The reactor chamber was the heart of the Argonaut, a critical area. If the Athex got their hands on it, the entire ship could be destroyed. But if Jaden was in there, she didn't hesitate. I'll handle the reactor. You get the wounded out. We're not leaving anyone behind. Hill nodded quickly, and Ilara turned, rushing down the nearest hallway. As she moved, the lights above her flickered in and out, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. There were signs of fierce combat here. Burn marks from energy weapons, doors torn off their hinges, and blaster fire scorched into the walls. Every step she took, every heartbeat that thundered in her chest, reminded her of the stakes. Earth was counting on them. The fleet was counting on her. And her brother was still out there, likely fighting for his life. The path to the reactor chamber was littered with debris, and every corner she turned held the threat of Athex soldiers lying in wait. The last few days of combat had already taken a toll, and though her instincts screamed at her to rush, Ilara kept her pace measured. Every move had to count. Suddenly, she heard the unmistakable hum of Athex blasters up ahead. Her hand instinctively went to the sidearm holstered at her waist. They were close now. Taking a deep breath, she readied herself for what was to come. She was no longer just a commander. She was a sister, a soldier, and a leader. Her duty was to protect her crew, to keep humanity's torch burning, no matter the cost. Then, a voice, faint but unmistakable, echoed down the hallway. Ilara. It was her brother's voice. Jaden. She shouted, her pulse quickening. She didn't wait for a response. Her legs moved faster now, the sound of her boots pounding against the metal floors mixing with the roar of the battle outside. Every inch brought her closer to him, to the reactor chamber, to their last stand. Then the unmistakable sound of Athex footsteps echoed in the hallway. Move, she shouted, sprinting toward the door. There was no turning back now. The door to the reactor chamber was fortified, one of the few places on the Argonaut that still held up against the Athex onslaught. Ilara could see scorch marks all over the walls surrounding it, evidence of the brutal fight that had raged to protect this last line of defense. She didn't have time to waste. Her brother's voice had been a whisper through the comms, barely audible over the din of combat. But it was enough. He was alive, and she was going to get him. She slammed her fist against the door's emergency override, watching the panels hiss and spark before the door began to groan open. The sounds of blaster fire and explosions echoed from down the hall, the clash of Earth's forces desperately trying to hold the line. Inside the chamber, she saw the source of the chaos. A group of Athex soldiers were positioned near the massive reactor core, firing at anyone who moved. Their advanced energy rifles cut through the air with deadly precision, while their cold, reptilian eyes scanned for any survivors. But they hadn't seen her yet. Ilara's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her breathing steady. She couldn't afford to let fear take control. Not now. Her hands were steady as she pulled her blaster from its holster. Every movement was calculated, controlled. Her mind was focused on one thing, getting to her brother. She ducked behind a large support column, using it as cover while she assessed the situation. Her eyes flicked quickly over the room. Jaden was there, in the corner, behind a stack of overturned crates. He was bleeding, his clothes torn, but he was still breathing, still fighting. And beside him, several crew members from the Argonaut, huddled behind debris, waiting for a chance to strike. The Athex were in a perfect position. Too well-armed, too numerous. But Ilara wasn't going to let that stop her. "Hold on, Jaden. I'm coming," she whispered to herself. She didn't have time to strategize. She was outnumbered, and the Athex soldiers would spot her the second she stepped out of cover. She needed a distraction. something to give her an edge. Her eyes shifted to a power conduit above the reactor core. A shot from a blaster could sever it, causing an overload. The resulting explosion would knock out the Athex's weapons, or at least disorient them long enough to give her an opening. Ilara took a deep breath and moved with quiet precision, circling around the edge of the room. She could feel the heat of the reactor core pulsing behind her, and the low hum of energy in the air buzzed against her skin. Her every step felt like it could be her last, but she pushed the thought away. There was no room for hesitation. Not now. With a swift motion, she aimed her blaster at the power conduit and fired. The shot hit the conduit with a sharp crack, and a moment later, sparks flew from the ruptured panel. The Athex soldiers turned in alarm as the entire chamber lit up in a flash of blinding white light. The blast caused the power systems to flicker, throwing the entire room into momentary darkness. It was all the time Ilara needed. She darted from her hiding place, charging toward the overturned crates where Jaden was crouched. The Athex were disoriented, trying to recalibrate their weapons, and that gave Ilara the perfect moment to strike. She reached Jaden, her breath ragged as she pulled him up. He was weak, but alive, his eyes lighting up when they met hers. "Ilara," he murmured, a mixture of relief and exhaustion in his voice. "I knew you'd come." "No time to explain," Ilara replied, pulling him toward the exit. "We're getting out of here. Now." As they reached the door, the Athex regained their composure, but it was too late. Ilara had already pushed the button to seal the reactor chamber, locking the Athex soldiers inside. The emergency protocol would hold them there for a few minutes, but they couldn't afford to wait. With Jaden leaning heavily on her, Ilara sprinted down the hall. She could hear the thundering footsteps of the Athex behind them, growing closer, but she kept running. The Argonaut was in critical condition, and they needed to get to the escape pods before the Athex tore through the ship's core. "Almost there," Ilara muttered under her breath, glancing back at Jaden. But the path was filled with chaos. Another explosion shook the ship, and Ilara stumbled, her hand shooting out to steady herself. Her heart raced. There was no guarantee they'd make it, not with the Athex bearing down on them. But she wasn't about to stop. Not now. "We'll make it," she whispered to herself, determination burning in her eyes. "We'll make it." The Argonaut was shaking violently now, every corner of the ship rattling with the force of the Athex assault. Ilara could feel it beneath her boots as she half-carried, half-dragged Jaden through the crumbling hallways. The ship's corridors, once pristine and orderly, had been transformed into a battlefield, debris and wreckage littering the floors, walls scorched by blaster fire. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning metal, and the hum of emergency alarms blared in her ears. Ilara's heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't afford to slow down. Every second they spent in these halls brought them closer to being cornered. The escape pods were their only hope now, but the way ahead wasn't clear. Athex soldiers were everywhere, patrolling the ship, and if they encountered a group, it could be their last stand. "We can make it," Jaden muttered, his voice strained but determined. "We just need to push through. The pods aren't far." "I know," Ilara responded, gritting her teeth, "but we're not getting caught. Stay close." They turned a corner, and a blast of energy tore through the air, narrowly missing them. Ilara instinctively shoved Jaden behind a bulkhead, both of them crouching low. The sound of heavy boots echoed in the distance, more Athex soldiers, likely searching for stragglers. Their footsteps grew louder, closer. "Not now," Ilara whispered, cursing under her breath. Her blaster was still holstered, but she wasn't going to waste ammunition on a distraction, not when their lives were at stake. Her mind raced. The corridor ahead was open, but it led directly toward a group of heavily armed Athex warriors. There was no way around them. They would be seen the moment they moved. Ilara looked at Jaden, who was breathing heavily, his strength starting to fade. He wasn't going to last much longer if they didn't get to those pods. She had to act. And quickly. "I'll draw their fire," Ilara said, her voice calm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "You make a break for the pods." "No." Jaden shook his head, a fierce determination in his eyes. "We're in this together, Ilara. We go together, or not at all." Ilara hesitated, her hand gripping her blaster tighter. She knew he was right. They were family. Fighting together had always been their way. And she wasn't about to leave him now. With a final nod, Ilara crouched low and darted around the corner, making herself a visible target. Her blaster was up in an instant, and she fired at the nearest group of Athex soldiers. The shot hit the floor beside them, sending a burst of sparks into the air. They immediately turned toward her, weapons raised, and Ilara sprinted backward, leading them away from Jaden. "Go," she yelled to him. "Now." Jaden didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, he ran in the opposite direction, his footsteps pounding down the hall. Ilara watched him for a split second, her heart in her throat, before she whirled around and sprinted in the opposite direction, firing as she ran to cover her escape. The Athex were quick to pursue, but Ilara was faster, weaving through the corridors with deadly precision. She had to stay ahead of them, keep them occupied. A lucky shot hit the wall beside her, and the force of the blast sent her tumbling to the ground. The world spun as she hit the floor hard, the pain shooting up her spine. She cursed, pushing herself back to her feet, but it cost her valuable time. Her vision blurred from the impact, and blood trickled from a gash above her eyebrow. But she couldn't stop. "Get up," she ordered herself, gritting her teeth as she pushed through the pain. She needed to buy Jaden more time. If they reached the escape pods, they could survive. The Athex would follow, but the ship wouldn't last much longer under their relentless assault. With one last desperate push, Ilara regained her footing, slamming her back into the wall for cover. The Athex soldiers were closing in, but she was close, so close. Up ahead, she saw the door to the escape pods. "Almost there," Ilara muttered, her pulse racing. But before she could make another move, the unmistakable sound of an Athex warrior's voice cut through the air. "You won't make it," the voice said, harsh and guttural. "Your fleet is already destroyed. Your people will be next." Ilara's hand tightened around her blaster, her body burning with fury. "You're wrong. Earth isn't finished. Not yet." And with that, she surged forward, blasting her way through the remaining Athex soldiers. The Argonaut was breaking apart around her, but she would not let it fall without a fight. Not while she still had breath in her lungs. The escape pod was within reach. The door to the escape pod bay loomed ahead, just beyond the shattered remains of a once pristine hallway. Ilara's heart thudded in her chest as she sprinted toward it, her every step an echo of the pounding terror in her ears. The ship was dying. The Athex had nearly overwhelmed them. And yet, somehow, the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Behind her, the sound of Athex footsteps grew louder, their energy weapons crackling as they prepared to fire. She didn't dare look back. Her focus was singular. Survive. Get to the pod. Get to safety. She wasn't about to let everything she and her people had fought for go to waste. The escape pod bay was still intact for now. The emergency lights flickered overhead, casting a sickly red glow that made the surroundings feel even more like a tomb than a lifeline. Ilara reached the door to the bay, slamming her palm against the control panel, hoping it would still function after everything the ship had endured. The green light above the door blinked to life, and with a hiss, the massive entry slid open. Inside, rows of escape pods sat, each one a potential lifeline for the remaining survivors of the Argonaut. But there was no time to pick one out. There was only time to escape. Ilara stumbled inside, hearing the rapid, panting footsteps of Jaden as he entered right behind her. His breath came in labored gasps, but he was still running. She didn't waste a moment, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the nearest pod. The door to it slid open, and she shoved him inside, not bothering to wait for him to take a seat before activating the controls. "We're getting out of here," Ilara said through gritted teeth, her voice laced with a combination of fear and defiance. Jaden collapsed into the seat, barely able to hold himself upright. His face was pale, his clothes soaked in sweat and blood. But his eyes held something that made Ilara's chest tighten. Relief. He was alive. She had brought him to safety. Ilara hit the final button, sealing the pod's door. The bay shook as another explosion rattled the ship. They were running out of time. The Argonaut was dying, and the Athex would soon realize that all the remaining escape pods had launched. With a sudden jolt, the pod detached from the Argonaut, tumbling into the void of space. The artificial gravity within the pod did little to ease the vertigo that struck her as the ship's last remains were left behind. She watched through the small viewport as the Argonaut, the ship that had been her home, her battleground, her last defense, began to disintegrate, a fiery explosion marking its final moments. It wasn't just the Argonaut that was dying. It was Earth's last great stronghold, the last defense between humanity and the Athex. But Ilara wasn't finished yet. She couldn't be. Her hand shook as she punched the emergency beacon on the console. There was no other way to call for help. They were alone in the vastness of space. The Athex were still out there, hunting down the last remnants of Earth's resistance, but they couldn't know that. They had to be kept off guard. The beacon would send a distress signal to any nearby fleets, but it was a long shot. The Athex had decimated Earth's forces, and the few remaining ships that had escaped into the depths of space were scattered. "Jaden," Ilara said, her voice soft as she turned to him. "Do you remember the mission? The coordinates we were given?" Jaden nodded, his face grim but resolute. "We get to the rendezvous point. We wait for reinforcements, if there are any." Ilara swallowed, her throat tight. There was so much uncertainty in those words. Reinforcements, a distant hope. But it was all they had, and it was enough. It had to be. The stars stretched out before them, silent, indifferent to the battle that had raged in their midst. Ilara glanced one last time at the devastation left behind by the Athex, knowing that they had escaped only for now. The real fight was still ahead. As the escape pod drifted deeper into the unknown, Ilara and Jaden prepared for the next phase of their journey. The battle was not over. The war was not over. Humanity had endured. They had fought for survival, and now they would fight for victory. The silence inside the escape pod was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the life support systems. Ilara sat at the control panel, her eyes fixed on the small viewport. The stars outside were distant, cold, but they were a reminder that they had survived. So far. Jaden, slumped in the seat beside her, had fallen into an exhausted slumber, his face pale but peaceful for the moment. She envied his ability to rest. Every part of her was wound tight, unable to shake the tension that had gripped her ever since the Argonaut had been torn apart. There was no real safety out here. Not yet. Not until they found their fleet, or the Athex were brought to their knees. Ilara leaned back in her seat, rubbing a hand over her face. The shock of their escape had worn off, replaced by the cold, gnawing anxiety of the unknown. The rendezvous point was a mere set of coordinates, a distant hope that another ship, any ship, would be there when they arrived. But Earth's forces had been shattered. The Athex were relentless, and the galaxy, it seemed, was closing in around them. She glanced down at the console again, the beacon still blinking, transmitting a distress signal into the empty void. She had no idea who might be listening, if anyone at all. Maybe there was a remote chance that a fleet had escaped the Athex's onslaught. Maybe the remnants of Earth's military were out there, regrouping in the far reaches of space. But even if they were, could they fight the Athex? The alien race was powerful, its technology unmatched, and they were not likely to rest until Earth, and every human, was wiped from the stars. The thought made Ilara's stomach turn. A soft groan from Jaden snapped her out of her thoughts. He stirred in his seat, his eyes fluttering open. She could see the pain etched across his face, the weariness that no amount of sleep could erase. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough with fatigue. "A few hours," Ilara replied, her tone steady, though her heart raced. "We're still on course. We'll reach the rendezvous soon." "But—" Jaden's gaze sharpened as he saw the uncertainty in her eyes. "But you don't think anyone's coming, do you?" Ilara didn't answer immediately. She didn't want to lie to him. Instead, she turned her focus back to the distant stars, feeling the weight of the truth sink in. The Athex had nearly destroyed Earth's forces. How could they hope to rebuild? How could they stop the oncoming storm that had already claimed so much? But she wouldn't give up. She had seen humanity's resilience up close, and it was something the Athex would never understand. Even now, as they drifted through the abyss, they were fighting. They were surviving. That was something. "Jaden," she said softly, her voice unwavering despite the turmoil inside. "We've been through worse, and we've survived. We will keep fighting. We have to." He nodded slowly, his expression grim but resolute. "You're right. We can't stop now. Earth won't fall to them. Not while we're still breathing." For the first time in hours, Ilara allowed herself a small, weary smile. She turned to the controls, watching the stars streak past as the pod's engines pushed them forward. She didn't know what lay ahead, or if their distress signal would be answered. She didn't know if they would find the rest of humanity, or if they would be alone in the darkness. But she did know this. The Athex had underestimated humanity. They had underestimated Earth. And now, humanity would rise again. The pod system beeped, indicating their arrival at the rendezvous point. Ilara's breath caught in her throat, the moment of truth at hand. She activated the sensors, scanning for any signs of life, any sign of hope. The blackness of space stretched endlessly before her, but there, in the distance, a faint signal flickered. A response. A ship. A silhouette against the stars. "Jaden, look!" Ilara exclaimed, her voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and triumph. "It's them. It's Earth's fleet." Jaden pushed himself upright, his eyes wide as he stared at the faint but unmistakable outline of the ship. It was battered, like the Argonaut, but it was still intact, still fighting. They weren't alone. Earth's final hope was not lost. A surge of energy coursed through Ilara as the pod automatically adjusted its course toward the fleet. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But now, there was a chance. Humanity was ready for its next battle. And this time, the Athex would learn the cost of underestimating the will of a people who had fought to the very last breath.